From the William B. Travis Building in Austin, Texas, we're keeping Texas energy on track. Here's your host, Bryce Doobie.
Welcome to Texas Energy on Track, the official podcast of the Railroad Commission of Texas. I am your host, Bryce Doobie, joined by my co-host and producer, Nick Krenoff. How are we doing today, Nick?
Doing pretty good. Always glad to be here on podcast day, and this one today is a day where I think I'm just going to sit back and relax because this is going to be like a mind-blowing show, I think, where I'm just like, wow, there's just so much. It's going to go over my head, even though we're talking under the ground.
Yes. This is going to be, for the folks who listen to this show, and we actually notice because we see on our analytics and the trends and things, and thank you for everyone out there who does listen, we know that the technical episodes and the ones where we kind of get into some of the sciencey stuff are really popular. So we are really excited today to be joined by James Harcourt. He's the manager of the Geologic Advisory Unit here at the Railroad Commission. Sir, how are you doing today?
I'm doing good. Thanks for inviting me.
We're going to dive into a bunch of different things, but before we get too far into it, tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, how long you've been at the commission, things like that.
Okay. I'm a geologist. I'm a professional geologist. I have degrees in geology, computer science, and I have an MBA, licensed in 4 states as a professional geologist, including Texas. I started out with Chevron oilfield research in California after I graduated, went to school in Utah and Arizona, and then kind of went into different things. I worked for a refining company, Brown and Root, for a long time, about 7 years. And then I worked in Florida for the Department of Environmental Protection. There's some drilling and other kinds of activities out there in the Everglades. And I also did injection wells and stuff. Then I worked a lot of drill rigs in the Marcellus and Utica plays up northeast. Did that for a while. Then I came to Houston and was the state-funded plugging lead for Gulf Coast. So we plugged a lot of wells, usually several hundred a year. And then I became the manager of the Groundwater Advisory Unit, which since has expanded. We've added other units to it.
Okay, so this is the Geologic Advisory Unit, and what's sort of the makeup of that unit?
So the main thing that we do in Geologic Advisory is we map groundwater, issue letters so that anybody that's drilling a well or plugging a well, running mechanical integrity tests, anything that they're doing engineering-wise, they need to know where the water is that we're trying to protect, because that's typically the most important commodity that we're trying to protect, soil and water. So we issue those letters. We issue maybe 50 to 150 a day. It's like 1,000 to 12 or 1,300 a month, because there's that many engineering activities in Texas that have the potential to affect groundwater. So we issue those, map the water, and then we have the Geologic Investigative Unit, where you don't know where it's coming from. It's stuff's coming out of the ground, or there's a crack opening up, or there's a sinkhole, and sometimes it's not related to oil and gas, and sometimes it is. So we need to do an investigation, collect real data. It's forensic in nature because these things could go to hearing. So you have to collect things in an evidentiary way.
So when we're talking about all of this, we're talking, and that's really kind of the focus we want to kind of chat about today with this subsurface investigation. From a very layman, I think I've said on the show before, I've taken 2 semesters of geology back in college forever ago, and then went off to study history. So my knowledge is very little, but we know what these geologic records are in these areas and what's in all the different layers and things and where the groundwater is and all of that. So when you're talking about an investigation and there may be something that needs to be looked at, what does that mean for to the layman?
Okay, so let's take the most common occurrence, which is a breakout of produced water, which means very salty water, maybe saltier even than ocean water. And we're trying to figure out, where is that coming from? First of all, is it gas or oil related? Because sometimes, there's saline formations that are coming up fault lines or something. And that's where you have your hot springs and everything that people go to. And that's not something you fix. That's just something that happens, right? But we'll go out there and characterize the water, try to figure out what kind of salinity it has, if there's any markers in there, elements or things that are unusual or would indicate what formation it's from. When they drill these oil and gas wells and other kind of wells, they put tools down the hole that gather information about the rock based on its properties, its permeability or porosity. Is it like a sponge or like a brick, right? And they'll be like a background radiation that'll pick up. So we can tell different rock types just based on the natural background radiation. And then there's electrical logs that they put in there too. And so we have a lot of these, and we'll look at it and we'll characterize the water because we have pretty much a good feel for where the water's more saline and where it's fresher.
Okay, so this is all really specifically tied to injection on when we're talking about this.
So typically, so a lot of people don't realize this, because when you think about oil and gas operations, you think about taking stuff out of the ground. Just like mining, you think about taking stuff out of the ground. But it turns out in oil and gas and in mining, the real challenge is the stuff that you take out has to go somewhere that you don't use. So in addition to oil and gas coming out of the ground, a lot of water comes with it, produced water. In the olden days, which weren't so long ago, it was mostly conventional production, which means they drill a hole into a porous and permeable formation and they suck out the water and the oil and gas, or the energy, if you want to call it that, and then they inject the water back in. Well, now we're unconventional. So unconventional is very tight formations, sort of like a phone book or a book, and they have to put water and sand grains into it so that it kind of opens those pages up so that the gas and the oil will come out. So that's what fracking is. They call it fracking. What we do now is called hydrofracking, because you just increase the water pressure enough that the natural weaknesses in the rock are exploited. They open up, the sand grains stay, the water comes back. Now you got to put the water somewhere. And you can't really put it back into those unconventional formations. They're just not set up for that. That's just not how the rock operates. So you have to put it somewhere where the water will stay, where there isn't that volume of water. And so occasionally we'll get overpressure situations. And you want to look at the available geophysical information to try to decide, what are these rock layers doing? First of all, what rock layers are there down there? Which ones could contain water or oil and gas? And then which ones have high salinity, which ones have low salinity? Because usually the shallow aquifers are where we get our drinking water. And so you have this kind of superficial layer that's close to the surface that's not confined, it's not pressured up. It's just whatever water drains into the soil and the rock. But then you have these layers under that which are impermeable to water or gas or oil. And the water that gets there comes from very far away, and then it just sort of trickles down, almost like being in a football stadium. Okay, like the people all pour in the beginning, and it's not that crowded. They all kind of go in and they fill the stadium. But, when the game's over and everyone's trying to get out at the same time, it pressures up, right? People have a hard time getting through. Rock is like that too. So when water first infiltrates in from a long distance away, it'll just travel for, hundreds of years, thousands, tens of thousands, even millions. And it'll travel its way down. But when you drill into it and start injecting more water, it pressures up, and it takes it a while to equilibrate. And so we use these characteristics to try to figure out where did it come from, how much is it, what zone did it come from? Again, is it oil and gas related, or is it something natural? Because it's not always oil and gas related.
So, just to be very simple about it, there's a lot of science and geology that goes into this.
Well, and necessarily so, because we're talking about these things typically cost millions of dollars to fix. It's not, like, hey, I got $10, let's fix it, And typically, if you can demonstrate using science and using information that's evidentiary, in other words, you could go to a hearing, present it, and then you could stand up to cross-examination. You present that to operators and they'll say, okay, But they're not in the business of trying to figure out where produced water from a mile or 2 miles away is coming from.
What are some of the recent technological changes in how we're doing these investigations and things that you've really seen?
We have better seismometers, and we have a thicker array of seismometers. So there's also seismic activity. And this is kind of how, so there's seismic surveys, which are human beings putting energy into the ground to try to figure out where faults are and what the structure looks like. Because the structure of the geology is very important too. And so what we want to do is sort of create a picture. And so those are the new tools, is that, like, we have this TexNet, which is far denser. So if there's earthquakes, we can spot faults and we know where they are. We also have a lot of radar and LIDAR and things that use sonar or energy to notice when soil is rising or sinking, when the ground is rising or sinking. And they rotate through, once a day or once every other day. Some of the technologies are only 10 years old, so you can't go back much further than that. But we noticed just like millimeter changes in the surface. And of course, plant growth and stuff, which is seasonal, might interfere with that. So you have to correct for all that. But we've found areas that were swelling, and then we have proactively said, hey, I think we need to manage this area because it's swelling. So that's an indication there may be a breakout. So we can do some stuff proactively, but a lot of what we do is reactive, and then we go out and we help out. So those are the main tools, but we also have these three-dimensional geologic GIS software packages that allow you to draw rock layers in kind of 3D, and then your borehole trajectories through those rocks, where they're either withdrawing or injecting, where they're cemented, and then you can kind of rotate it, and there's multiple layers. And it's this kind of thing where a fifth grader can solve it. Well, once you get these three-dimensional models very complete, grab this fifth grader and go, hey, here's where the thing started, and here's where it's coming out. How do you think it got there? And they'll go, it went there, and it went up that, and it went over there. And, well, you got it.
That's really, really cool.
Yeah.
And we have something, I've heard it, I don't know, I'm unfamiliar, a DICE?
Yeah.
So it's the Drilling Insight
Drilling
Estimator. That's in my notes.
Yes,
I have no idea what this is.
Okay, so Drilling Insight and Casing Estimator started out in, I think it was 2004 is when it was first financed, and it was actually TCQ. And it was when the group that I head up, the Groundwater Advisory Group, was at the TCQ. And it was for locating groundwater, for mapping groundwater, because we're doing like 1,500 investigations a month, like where's the water there, where's the water there, all over the state, right? But at some point, they want to take all those point investigations and create kind of surfaces, where exactly is the water between those points? So that was an effort started in 2004. It continued, it followed us when we got here in 2011. So Bureau of Economic Geology at University of Texas, they house the site, they own the site, they're responsible for the data on it. But we give them our data, they take that data, and they turn these point groundwater investigations into surfaces. So now we understand where the groundwater is. We started adding other layers to it probably in, 2017, 2018. We started adding well layers for oil and gas wells, water wells, and things like that, because wherever a water well is screened, there's probably water there. So that can help you to map out groundwater. And then we started adding fault layers and things. There was a lot of seismic activity. And so we started putting some of that information on there, faults that we know about and that BEG knows about, so that operators will be aware in advance, and so our permit reviewers will be aware. And then seismic review areas and other things we put on the map. We also put formations that are problematic for drilling, either high-pressure formations or salt formations that could dissolve and create a sinkhole. And so we're mapping that out to help inform drilling and plugging activities, which require engineering review, but they have to know geologically, where are these things that we're trying to either avoid or accommodate.
So these tools, I mean, they're helpful for the production of all these resources, but it sounds like also it's helpful for the operators.
So there's a lot of information on this site that's useful for locating all sorts of artificial penetrations, because we have injection wells that are managed by TCQ, injection wells that are managed by RC. We also have new sources of fresh water. There's something called aquifer storage and recharge. It's a well where when the rivers and the creeks are high during flood events, they put that water into a tank and pump it under the ground and recharge the aquifer. So we need to know where those are too. Texas Water Development Board, they're declaring areas for desalination that are higher salinity than we would use today. But we believe in 20 years, we're going to want that water and we're going to desalinate it, and it's what we're going to be drinking.
It sounds like it's a lot of data, but it does seem like there's so many different applications for it going forward.
Right. And I've set it up so that on the left side, you've got broad categories that you pick, and then you can turn the layers on for those categories. There can be an information overload if you just turn everything on. So you want to go in there with a reason to investigate, and there's kind of like 5 reasons. There's groundwater, seismicity, artificial penetrations, and geohazards. And so you pick one of those. And then within it, add stuff and see what's there.
And just kind of, again, entry-level question here. I would imagine that there are, depending on where you are in the state, there's some significant geological differences when you're talking East Texas versus out in the Permian, things like that, you different considerations that you're looking at.
And faults and stuff. Some areas are heavily faulted, other areas aren't. Some areas have salt formations, other areas don't have the salt formations, and those are the ones more likely to kind of dissolve and be responsible for creating sinkholes and things.
Can you walk us through how the RC really determines sort of where fresh and usable quality water exists when you were talking sort of about all that?
Sure. I think of there being sort of three distinct investigations. Investigation one is just look for water wells, because if there's an active water well there, there's probably water. So that's step one. Step two is whenever they drill oil and gas wells, regardless of what the purpose of the well is, they typically run a tool in there we call a logging tool. And it's almost like a CAT scan or an X-ray or something like that. It's a way to visualize what's under the ground or record what's under the ground using some sort of energy source and then present it in a visual form. And so the majority of the work that we do are with these well logs. And then we use sometimes three-dimensional geologic software packages to plot those curves. And then we kind of trace across them where we think the tops of formations are, where groundwater that is fresh might be, and groundwater that's saline, and where there may be oil.
Because like you were saying earlier, with those rocks have those different densities and things. At
and
different layers,
properties
so
and fluids
you
too.
You can keep things, or if we know this formation goes this direction, the water's going to move with it.
And so if you're sending an electrical tool down there that's trying to create a current, if it goes into oil, there's going to be no current. If it goes into water that's very, very fresh, it'll be a light current. But if it goes into super saline water, that's going to be a strong current.
What are some of, when it comes to groundwater protection, what are some of the more common challenges that operators encounter when they're really sort of like planning all this? I mean, you sort of described they're using these tools, but is that really the big...
Well, so in the ideal drilling operation, they know where the groundwater starts and ends, or how many sections there are of it that they're trying to protect. And then they drill into it with a tool that helps them measure it directly, because sometimes things don't go according to plan. But what they've got to do is get the drilling operations to occur in a way that don't damage the water. So you can drill on something called reverse air, which is more water and air. It doesn't involve muds or oils. And you drill, and then you're using just whatever the pressure is of the formation. Typically those are shallow. And then they set shallow casing. But you'll get these rock bits or other like diamond bits that drill faster and harder rock and deeper. And then they'll throw what they call mud. It's mostly clay. You'll throw that in there to hold fluids in. You know, in the old days, we used to see like a bunch of oil squirting out of the ground. Okay, well, that doesn't happen anymore, because that's not very economic to let all your oil and gas get away from you. So that's what the mud is for. It keeps the fluids in the holes. Now, if you overweight the mud, now you're going to be pushing the mud into the formation, and that's going to cause trouble with the water you're trying to protect or the oil that you're trying to get out. So you have to keep that mud in balance as you drill, okay? Then you put casing in the hole, because rock will, you drill a deep hole, it's going to cave in at some point probably. So you put steel in the hole typically, and then you run cement up the outside of it and flush that mud out, if that's what you're using, with that cement. And then the cement kind of percolates into the formation and sits right up against that metal and creates a seal. So now you don't really have a hole, quote, in the ground. You have this portal into the ground, which is keeping all fluids separated and the water protected.
How often is this data changing?
It's a good point. So actual water quality and water levels of groundwater, they will change over time, just that aspect of it. But usually you're talking about decades or hundreds of years or thousands of years, okay? But what really changes frequently is the quality and the quantity of data that we have in a location. So we've come up with this number, 5 years. And what we've said is we'll do an investigation, we'll issue a determination, and you can use that for 5 years. But then we want to go back and go, hey, have we gotten smarter in the last 5 years? Is there more data that there wasn't there?
You've mentioned all these different technologies. I know we're using satellites and things now, all sorts of stuff. What do you think the future, just this geology-driven regulation, looks like over maybe the next decade or so?
I think the future is more about getting this information packaged in a form and a location that operators and reviewers, regulators can get to, so that we're looking at data sets that we have a lot of confidence in, and we're talking about the same data. And I think this DICE site, Drilling Insight and Casing Estimator site, is one of those tools because multiple agencies are putting information in there. I also think these 3D kind of visualization tools are becoming more popular, but AI is coming in because we talked about these well logs and they have curves and then we try to match them up. Mm-hmm. And we typically have had humans doing that, but we now have artificial intelligence and machine learning, and they can go in and do a lot of that work. You know, for me right now, you talked also about Texas is very diverse, and I have to do the whole state. And so I may be working in a county somewhere that I just don't happen to know the geology for that county. And in the old days, I'd go on to Google or something, or I'd go to a library, right, and spend hours searching for information and reading through. I can just, with AI, I can just say, you know, tell me about the formations that are in this county at this depth. It tells me. And of course, I have to do some quality check on it. Okay. And I can pose very specific questions about the geology in the rock and get responses. So I think that's going to help us a lot too.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for joining us. I always love these sort of headier conversations about some of the more scientific stuff. So thank you so much for joining us again today. This is a really interesting thing. I hope our listeners really got something out of all of this. James Harcourt, thank you, sir, so much for joining us.
Yes, sir.
You know, Bryce, I was actually just while you guys were talking, I did enter into a specific AI about geologic surface in a random county in Texas that I know. You get a lot of information in there in about 10 seconds.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many resources that we've built out. It's really exciting to see what the future is going to hold for all these data sets and things.
You know, with technology these days, you can get on places like X and look at TXRRC. That's where we're located on that platform. LinkedIn and Facebook, we're Railroad Commission of Texas. Instagram at Railroad Commission of Texas. And of course on YouTube, Railroad Commission of Texas. And then, you know, we thank everybody for listening on your favorite podcast app, of course, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Audible, Amazon Alexa. We're out on all these platforms, and make sure you subscribe. You get those notifications when those new episodes are posted. And then also you can share. We post a lot of information on our social media pages. Share them. Hit the share button on your favorite social media platform and spread the word about the podcast because we love the people who are listening, but we know they find it interesting. Other people do as well. So share it with your family, friends, even share it with your enemies.
Yeah, no, one amazing segue on technology there. That would just have to give a shout out to that. But as always, this has been Texas Energy on Track, the official podcast of the Railroad Commission of Texas. Thank you so much for joining us, and we will talk to you all soon.